Hello everyone, I'm Naila Alivia Yustin and welcome. If you've ever participated in an English debate competition, you've probably experienced this situation before. Like the motion appears on the screen, everyone starts writing ideas immediately, and you're sitting there wondering, like, what exactly is this motion asking me to do? And honestly, that's one of the biggest challenges for beginner debaters. Like many people focus heavily on memorizing current issues, statistics, and examples, but they never learn how to identify the type of motion they're facing. As a result, they often use the wrong approach. Sometimes they debate a value motion like policy motion. Sometimes they propose solutions when the motion is actually asking them to compare principles. So, in this video, we're going to break down the 6 most common debate motion types you will encounter. And for each one, we will discuss how to recognize it, what judges are usually looking for, common mistakes that beginners make, or how both government and opposition can approach it effectively. So let's get started. Let's start with probably the most common type of motion you'll see in debate competitions: policy motions. Whenever you see phrases like "this house would," also known as THW, "this house supports," or THS, or motions involving banning, legalizing, regulating, funding, or implementing something, you're most likely dealing with a policy motion. For example, this house would ban social media for children under 16. Now, here's the most important thing to understand. A policy motion always resolves around a problem. Before thinking about arguments, ask yourself first, what problem is this policy trying to solve? That's where your analysis should begin. And as government, your job is usually quite straightforward. Like you need to prove three things. First, the problem exists. Second, your policy solves or significantly reduce that problem. And third, the benefits created by the policy outweigh any harms. For example, government could argue that children are especially vulnerable to cyberbullying or online addiction and exposure to harmful content, and restricting social media access protects them during a critical stage of development. Meanwhile, opposition doesn't have to prove that social media is perfect. That's a very common misconception. Instead, opposition can argue that the policy won't work effectively, creates new problems, or that there are better alternatives available. For instance, they could argue that the ban is difficult to enforce and may actually prevent children from developing healthy digital literacy skill. One thing judges especially look for in policy debate is mechanism and analysis. In simple terms, they want to know how exactly does the policy create the outcome you're talking about. So don't just say the policy is good, but also explain the process. The clearer your mechanism is, the stronger your argument could become. Okay, so next let's talk about value motions. These motions are less about actions and more about principles, morality, priorities, and beliefs. You'll often recognize them through phrases like "this house believes that," or THBT, "this house regrets," or THR, and "this house reverse," or THP. For example, This house believes that success is more important than happiness. Notice something important here. The motion isn't asking us to create a law. It isn't asking us to implement a policy. Instead, it's asking us to determine which value should be prioritized. That's why many beginners struggle with value debates because they start proposing solution when the debate is actually talking about principles. Government might argue that success provides stability, financial security, opportunities, and long-term fulfillment. Opposition might argue that happiness is the ultimate purpose of life, and that success means very little if people remain unhappy. What's important here is understanding that both values can be positive. The debate isn't about proving one side is good and the other is bad. The debate is about proving which value should matter more when the two come into a conflict. Another thing judges often appreciate in value debates is philosophical consistency. If you are arguing that happiness is the most important value, then your entire case should consistently support that principle. The same goes for success, freedom, equality, dignity, or whatever value you are defending. The clearer your value framework is, the easier it becomes for judges to follow your logic. Okay, so now let's move on the comparative motions. These motions ask you to compare two different worlds, systems, choices, or approaches. You will usually see words such as prefer, rather than, better than, or compared to. For example, this house prefers free university education over merit-based scholarships. And now, here's one of the most useful lessons for comparative debates. You do not need to prove your world is perfect. You only need to prove that your world is better than the alternative one. Government might argue that free university education ensures equal access for all students regardless of economic background. And the opposition might argue that merit-based scholarship encourage hard work and allocate resources more efficiently. Notice that both sides can have advantage, and that's completely normal because comparative debates aren't about finding a perfect solution, but they're about identifying which option creates better overall outcomes. A common mistake beginners make is spending too much time talking about the strength of their own side while completely ignoring the other side. But comparison is the entire point of the motion. Always ask yourself, compared to what? So every benefit should be weighed against an alternative. Every impact should be compared with the other world's impact. So that's how comparative debates are won. Okay, the fourth type is the actor motions. Actor motions require you to argue from the perspective of a specific stakeholder. For example, this house, as parents, will strictly monitor children's online activities, or this house as developing countries, or this house as universities. When you like phrases like this, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what does this actor care about? This question is extremely important because one of the biggest mistakes debaters make is arguing from their personal perspective rather than the actor's perspective. So let's use the parent example for a simple one. The government might argue that parents have a responsibility to protect children from online dangers, harmful content, and cyberbullying. And the opposition might argue that excessive monitoring damages trust and prevents children from developing independence and responsibility. Both arguments can work, but notice that both sides are still thinking as parents. That's exactly what judges want to see. Actor motions are about two incentives, like what motivates this actor, what are their responsibilities, what are their priorities, and once you answer those questions, finding arguments will become much easier. So whenever you encounter an actor motion, don't ask what do I think, but instead ask what would this actor realistically want. Okay, so now let's discuss hypothetical motions. These are often some of the most interesting motions in debate because they create imaginary situations. You will frequently see phrases such as assuming that, or in a world where, or imagine that, or even suppose that. For example, assuming technology can erase painful memories, so this house would allow its use. The most important rule for hypothetical debates is very simple. The first one is accept the premise. Like, don't waste your speech, don't waste your time saying that the technology doesn't exist yet, because the motion already asks you to assume it exists. So just accept it and move forward. Government might argue that people can recover from trauma more effectively, improve their mental health, and live happier lives. An opposition could argue that painful experiences contribute to personal growth, resilience, and or identity formation. What's interesting about hypothetical debates is that they often test your ability to think about consequences. You're not debating whether the scenario is realistic. You're debating whether the world created by that scenario is desirable. Another common mistake is focusing only on immediate impacts. I try to think about long-term consequences as well. Like, how does society change, or how do relationships change, how do institutions change, and many other. Like, the teams that can answer those questions usually perform very well in hypothetical debates. Okay, finally, let's talk about factual motions. These motions ask you to evaluate whether a statement about reality is true. For example, this house believes that social media has done more harm than good. At first glance, this may look similar to a value motion because it starts with THBT, but there's a key difference. A value motion asks what should matter more, but a factual motion asks what is actually happening in reality. Government might argue that social media increases misinformation or political polarization, cyberbullying, and mental health problems. And then opposition could argue that social media improves communication and education as well, activism, and access to a lot of information. The debate is essentially about weighing evidence and impacts. which side provides a more convincing explanation of reality. A mistake many beginners make is listening to many examples without analysis. Because remember, examples support arguments, they don't replace arguments. Judges are usually more interested in your explanation than your example. So focus on developing a few strong arguments instead of 10 but weak ones. Quality almost beat a quantity. Okay, now that we've covered the 6 motion types, let's talk about argument construction. No matter what type of motion you receive, a simple structure can help you build clearer arguments. I like using 4-step, which is PREI, P for point, R for reason, E for example, and I for impact. Let's look at a simple example. Like the point is social media harms teenagers. So the reason it encourages unhealthy comparison. Like for example, teenagers constantly compare themselves to influencers and unrealistic lifestyle online and so on. So the impact, this can reduce self-esteem, increase anxiety, and negatively affect mental health. Notice how each part builds upon the previous one. Many debaters stop after the point. Like strong debaters continue all the way to the impact. That's what makes an argument seems like persuasive. Okay, before we finish, here are 5 quick tips that can improve your debating immediately. First, identify the motion type before generating arguments. The right analysis starts with understanding what the most motion actually wants. Second, don't just tell judges what happens, but explain why it happens. And third, compare impacts directly. Make it easy for judges to understand why your side is matters more. And fourth, prioritize quality over quantity. 3 well-developed arguments are usually better than 6 but shallow ones. And finally, keep asking yourself one simple question. Why? Because the more layers of explanation you can provide, the stronger your analysis could become. Okay, so to recap, the 6 most common debate motion types are: the first is police motions, the second is value motions, the third is comparative motions, the fourth is actor motions, the fifth is hypothetical motions, and the last one is factual motions. Once you are able to identify these motion types quickly, debate preparations becomes more easier because you will know exactly what kind of analysis the motion requires. Remember, debating isn't just about speaking confidently. It's also about understanding the question, wielding logical arguments, and explaining your reasoning clearly. Okay, so thank you so much for watching. I hope this guide helps you in your future debates competition, maybe. And good luck, keep practicing, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.